The courtroom was a theater of control, its cold authority woven into every creak of the polished wooden benches and the sharp glare of fluorescent lights. The faint hum of whispered conversations buzzed under the surface, like static in a tense storm. It was the kind of place where silence wasn't just expected, it was demanded, punctuated by the decisive strikes of a judge's gavel. Among the faces in the jury pool sat Marcus Steele, a man who seemed ordinary at first glance, neatly pressed charcoal suit, leather briefcase balanced on his lap, and an air of quiet attentiveness. His dark eyes scanned the room with a calm that belied the tension coursing through his veins. Marcus wasn't here by chance. He never was. Marcus, 38, was the kind of person you'd want on your side in a crisis. Raised in a working-class neighborhood by parents who balanced endless shifts to keep food on the table, he understood hardship in ways most people couldn't. His father, a truck driver with a knack for storytelling, taught Marcus to always look beyond the surface of things, while his mother, a nurse who rarely slept, taught him resilience. But the lessons life had etched into Marcus weren't just about survival. He was here today not as a bystander, but as a purposeful participant. As a federal investigator for the Department of Justice, Marcus had spent years uncovering corruption and challenging systemic abuses of power. Yet, he knew the greatest battles weren't fought in headlines or dramatic arrests. They unfolded quietly, insidiously, in rooms like this one. Today, Marcus wasn't investigating a case. He was a prospective juror, called to serve in what should have been a mundane civic duty. But as he observed the room, especially the man presiding over it, his instincts told him this would be anything but ordinary. At the helm of the courtroom sat Judge Edward Hartwell, his silver-rimmed glasses glinting under the harsh lights. Hartwell carried himself with the kind of authority that was less earned and more imposed, his narrowed eyes scanning the jury pool like a hawk sizing up prey. There was something about his posture, rigid, almost disdainful, that struck Marcus immediately. He couldn't shake the feeling that Hartwell wasn't looking for impartiality, he was looking for control, and Marcus had no intention of giving it to him. The room fell into a strained silence as Judge Hartwell began the jury selection process. His voice, clipped and formal, carried an air of impatience. One by one, he scrutinized the prospective jurors, his gaze sharp as a blade. When Marcus's name was called, he stood, his hands steady but his heart beating with a quiet intensity. Hartwell's eyes locked onto him, narrowing ever so slightly. "Mr. Steele," the judge began, his tone laden with a polite veneer that barely masked the skepticism underneath. "You've indicated that you work for the Department of Justice. That's a rather unique position for a juror, wouldn't you say?" Marcus nodded. "I've taken an oath to uphold the law, Your Honor. I believe that makes me well suited to serve impartially." The judge raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "And yet, wouldn't your professional background make it difficult to remain unbiased? After all, someone so deeply entrenched in the legal system might have preconceived notions." It was a thinly veiled accusation, one Marcus had anticipated. "Your Honor," he replied evenly, "my career is built on evidence and facts, not assumptions. I trust the same applies in this courtroom." A flicker of annoyance crossed Hartwell's face. "We'll see." As the selection continued, Marcus noticed a pattern. The judge seemed to press harder on jurors of color. His tone more curt, his dismissal swifter. When Hartwell excused the second black juror for reasons that rang hollow, Marcus felt the weight of systemic bias pressing down on the room. Then came the decision. "Mr. Steele," Hartwell said, his voice cold, "I'm excusing you for cause. Your background raises too many questions about your impartiality." The words hit like a slap. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. This wasn't about him. It was about something far bigger, something deeply wrong. It was clear now. Marcus wasn't just being excluded. He was being silenced, and he wasn't going to let that happen. The words echoed in Marcus's mind as he gathered his belongings and stood, his movements deliberate despite the growing storm within him. Judge Hartwell's cold dismissal wasn't just a rejection, it was an assertion of control, a reminder of the systemic barriers Marcus had spent his life fighting. But this time, Marcus wasn't just an observer, he was part of the story. As Marcus turned to leave, a soft voice stopped him. "Mr. Steele?" He looked over to see Maya Patel, a young defense attorney with sharp eyes and an air of quiet determination. She had been observing the proceedings from the back of the room, her notebook filled with meticulous notes. "I couldn't help but notice the judge's questions," she said, her tone careful. "It didn't feel right." Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. "It wasn't." Maya hesitated, then spoke more urgently. "I've seen this before. Judge Hartwell has a reputation for being selective in his jury pools, but excusing you? That was blatant. Are you planning to challenge it?" Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. "I wasn't planning on walking away quietly." As Maya outlined her observations, Marcus noticed other jurors watching them, their faces a mix of unease and curiosity. One of them, a middle-aged man named George, a teacher from a nearby school, approached. "This doesn't feel right," George said. "The way he's been dismissing people, it's not fair." The murmurs grew louder as others chimed in, their frustration palpable. Yet, even as Marcus found allies among the jurors, the challenge of confronting a sitting judge loomed large. Judge Hartwell had the power of the bench, and Marcus knew any misstep could backfire. Determined to take a stand, Marcus approached the court clerk during a recess. "I'd like to file a formal objection to my dismissal," he said. The clerk looked at him with raised eyebrows. "That's highly irregular." "So is being dismissed for doing my job," Marcus replied. The clerk hesitated, then handed Marcus a form. As Marcus filled it out, he noticed another figure watching him closely. Rachel Jennings, the assistant district attorney prosecuting the case. She approached him with a cautious smile. "Mr. Steele," she began, "I admire your persistence, but Judge Hartwell isn't the kind of man who takes well to challenges." "Then he's not the kind of man who should be on the bench," Marcus countered. Rachel nodded, her expression hardening. "Fair point. If you need any information for your objection, let me know. You're not wrong about what's happening here." Bolstered by this unexpected support, Marcus submitted his objection and returned to the courtroom, now as an observer. As the selection continued, he saw the same pattern repeating. Subtle biases woven into the judge's questioning, more jurors of color dismissed for vague reasons. Then came the twist. During a break, Maya approached Marcus with a document. "You need to see this," she said, handing him a file she had pulled from public records. It was a transcript from another case presided over by Hartwell. The pattern was unmistakable, disproportionately excusing jurors of color, often under the guise of impartiality. The implications were damning. Marcus felt a surge of righteous anger. "This isn't just about me," he said. "This is about every person who's been denied their right to serve because of this man's bias." Maya nodded. "If we can prove a pattern, we might have a case for formal inquiry, but we'll need more than this one transcript." The stakes were growing, and so was the resistance. Word of Marcus's objections spread quickly, drawing the attention of reporters covering the trial. As cameras began to flash outside the courthouse, Judge Hartwell grew visibly agitated, his carefully controlled demeanor slipping. "Mr. Steele," Hartwell said during the next session, his voice tight with frustration, "your objection has been noted. However, I must remind you that this court operates under my discretion, and under the law," Marcus replied, his tone measured but firm. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Hartwell glared at Marcus but didn't respond. As the day wore on, more allies emerged. Maya enlisted other attorneys to dig into Hartwell's record, while Rachel discreetly shared case files that revealed further inconsistencies in the judge's rulings. George and other dismissed jurors began speaking to the press, their voices amplifying the growing chorus of dissent. But the fight wasn't without complications. Hartwell retaliated by doubling down on his authority, threatening contempt charges against Marcus and others who questioned him. And as the pressure mounted, Marcus felt the weight of his role. This wasn't just about exposing one man, it was about confronting a system designed to protect men like Hartwell. Through it all, Marcus held his ground. Small victories, like gaining access to more evidence, fueled his determination. But he knew the real test was yet to come. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The courtroom was electric with tension as Marcus Steele stepped forward, standing tall against the storm that Judge Hartwell had tried to suppress. The murmurs of the jury pool and the steady clicks of reporters' cameras filled the space, but Marcus's focus was unshakable. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady but charged with emotion, "I'm here today not just as a prospective juror, but as a citizen committed to justice. The decisions made in this room don't just affect one case. They define what fairness looks like in our society. And right now, fairness is on trial." Judge Hartwell's eyes narrowed, his gavel raised. "Mr. Steele, you've overstepped. This is not the place for grandstanding." "With respect, Your Honor, this is the place," Marcus replied, his tone wavering. "This courtroom is supposed to represent equality under the law. Yet the record shows a troubling pattern. Jurors of color are disproportionately dismissed from your cases. That's not impartiality. That's bias." The courtroom fell silent. Hartwell's face reddened. But before he could respond, Maya Patel stood. "Your Honor," she interjected, holding up a folder, "we've compiled evidence from previous cases that supports Mr. Steele's claims. The numbers don't lie. Nearly 70% of dismissed jurors in your courtroom over the past 5 years have been people of color." Gasps rippled through the room as Maya handed the documents to the court clerk. Judge Hartwell's grip tightened on the gavel. "This is highly irregular," he snapped. "These proceedings are not subject to public inquiry." "But they should be," Rachel Jennings said, rising from the prosecution table. "If we're to trust the integrity of this trial, it's imperative to address these concerns transparently." Hartwell slammed his gavel. "Enough," he barked. "This is my courtroom, and I will not tolerate these baseless accusations." Marcus took a step closer to the bench, his voice rising but controlled. "This isn't just about you, Judge Hartwell. It's about the people you silence when you dismiss them without cause. It's about every defendant who didn't get a fair trial because the jury wasn't truly representative of their peers. It's about a system that allows this to happen unchecked." For a moment, Hartwell seemed at a loss for words. His usual authority, so absolute, was slipping away. The room was no longer his domain. It belonged to the voices of those he had tried to suppress. The final blow came when George, the teacher dismissed earlier, stood from his seat. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firm, "as an American, I trust the justice system to be fair. What's happening here is not fair. And it's not right." One by one, other dismissed jurors stood echoing George's sentiment. Their unified stance was undeniable, a powerful symbol of resistance against systemic bias. Judge Hartwell looked out over the courtroom, his authority crumbling under the weight of collective truth. For the first time, he seemed small. "Mr. Steele," he said finally, his voice subdued, "your objection has been noted. The matter will be reviewed." Marcus nodded, his resolve unbroken. The fight wasn't over, but in this moment, a crack had appeared in the walls of injustice, and cracks, Marcus knew, could grow. In the days that followed, Judge Hartwell's courtroom became the center of a firestorm. News outlets seized on the evidence of bias, amplifying the voices of the dismissed jurors and shining a harsh light on systemic inequities in the justice system. The State Judicial Review Board announced an investigation into Hartwell's record, and for the first time in his career, the judge was forced to confront public accountability. Marcus Steele watched the unfolding events with a mix of pride and quiet determination. He hadn't set out to make headlines, but the impact was undeniable. The transcripts and testimonies collected with the help of Maya Patel and Rachel Jennings were already sparking wider conversations about jury selection practices and judicial accountability. For Marcus, the victory wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal. Growing up, he had witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of injustice, watching neighbors and family members struggle against a system that often seemed rigged against them. Standing up in that courtroom wasn't just about challenging one judge, it was about honoring those experiences and refusing to let them define the future. 1 week later, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium at a community event organized by local activists. He was invited to speak about his experience and what it meant for the broader fight for equity. "This isn't just my story," Marcus said, his voice resonating with the crowd. "It's the story of everyone who's ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced because of who they are. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen because of one person. It happens when we come together, speak out, and demand better." The audience erupted in applause, but Marcus raised a hand to quiet them. "And this fight isn't over. It's on each of us to hold the system accountable, not just in courtrooms, but in every space where fairness and equality are on the line. We all have a role to play." As Marcus stepped off the stage, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time he saw a glimmer of hope, a crack in the foundation of injustice, ready to be widened by those who dared to push.